North Africa, October 1942. A British field medic knelt beside an Italian pilot bleeding out in the sand, chest torn open by shrapnel. Every medical protocol said the man would be dead within minutes. But in the medic's pack was something revolutionary, something that would challenge everything the enemy thought they knew about battlefield medicine. What happened next would rewrite the rules of war itself. 17 to 34 hours, 23rd October 1942. The Western Desert, 73 miles southwest of El Alamein. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Celsius as the sun bled orange across dunes still radiating heat from the day's bombardment. The air tasted of cordite and diesel, thick enough to coat the back of Captain James Hartley's throat as he crouched behind a burned-out Crusader tank, listening to the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery. German 88s, 3 seconds out, impact imminent. The explosion showered sand and shrapnel across the British field dressing station, a pathetic arrangement of canvas tarps strung between two medical lorries. Hartley pressed himself flat, covering his head, waiting for the ringing in his ears to subside enough to hear screaming. There was always screaming after the 88s hit, but when the dust cleared, the sound that reached him was different, quieter. The wet, labored breathing of a man drowning in his own blood. Hartley scrambled forward, medical pack bouncing against his hip, and found the source, an Italian pilot, perhaps 25 years old, half buried in sand, his leather flight jacket torn open to reveal a chest wound the size of a fist. Shrapnel from the crashed Machi fighter 50 yards away had punched through his ribcage and into his lung. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and arterial, soaking into sand that couldn't absorb it fast enough. "Bloody hell!" muttered Corporal Davies, Hartley's Welsh assistant, dropping to his knees beside the wounded man. "He's got minutes, sir, maybe less." Hartley knew Davies was right. He'd seen this wound pattern 47 times since arriving in North Africa 6 months earlier. 47 times and 47 deaths. The mathematics were simple and absolute. Massive chest trauma plus arterial bleeding plus shock equaled death, usually within 12 minutes. Standard protocol was morphine for the pain, a cigarette if the patient could manage it, and a chaplain if one was available. The Italian pilot's eyes flickered open. They were brown, Hartley noticed, and terrified. The young man tried to speak, but only produced a wet, gurgling sound. His lips were already turning blue. "Don't try to talk," Hartley said, his Italian serviceable if heavily accented. "You're safe now. You're with British Medical." The pilot's hand shot out, gripping Hartley's wrist with surprising strength. In that touch, Hartley felt the universal language of dying men, the desperate animal refusal to accept extinction. The pilot wasn't ready. None of them ever were. Hartley looked at Davies. "Get the plasma." Davies blinked. "Sir?" "The plasma from the cold box. Now." "Captain, he's Italian, he's enemy. And the plasma's meant for our lads." "Corporal Davies." Hartley's voice went quiet. The dangerous kind of quiet that Welsh mining families recognized instinctively. "Get the plasma." Davies hesitated for half a second, then scrambled toward the lorry. The plasma had arrived 3 weeks earlier, shipped from a laboratory in Cambridge via Cairo, packed in insulated containers filled with ice that had mostly melted during the journey. 48 bottles of amber liquid, each containing freeze-dried human blood plasma that could be reconstituted with sterile water and transfused directly into a dying patient's veins. Revolutionary, experimental, controversial. Hartley had attended the briefing at the field hospital in Alexandria, where a starched army doctor with a Cambridge accent had explained the science in terms that made half the assembled medical officers' eyes glaze over. But Hartley had paid attention because Hartley had held too many dying men and watched them slip away despite everything he tried. The problem was simple. Battlefield trauma killed through blood loss and shock. A soldier could survive almost any wound if you could replace the blood volume fast enough and stabilize blood pressure. But whole blood required refrigeration, typing, matching. It degraded within days. It was impossible to stockpile, impossible to transport to forward positions, impossible to administer quickly enough when men were bleeding out in the sand 70 miles from the nearest hospital. Plasma was different. Plasma was the liquid component of blood, stripped of its red cells, but retaining the proteins and clotting factors that maintained blood pressure and prevented shock. It could be freeze-dried, stored indefinitely, reconstituted in seconds, and transfused into any patient regardless of blood type. It was medical alchemy, turning something perishable into something eternal. It was also unproven. The British military had conducted exactly 14 field trials with mixed results. The Americans were experimenting with similar technology, but their trials were equally preliminary. No one knew if it actually worked under combat conditions. No one knew if the freeze-drying process degraded the proteins. No one knew if mass-produced plasma would cause adverse reactions. What Hartley knew was that 47 men had died in his care with their standard equipment, and he was tired of the mathematics of dying. Davies returned with a bottle of plasma powder and a canteen of sterile water. His hands shook slightly as he mixed the solution, watching it turn from yellow powder to amber liquid. "Ready, sir." Hartley had already found a vein in the Italian pilot's arm, difficult, with blood pressure collapsing, and inserted the needle. The pilot barely reacted. He was drifting toward unconsciousness, his breathing increasingly shallow and irregular. "Start the drip, slow and steady." The plasma began flowing into the pilot's vein, carrying with it the accumulated proteins of perhaps a dozen anonymous British donors. Hartley watched the pilot's face, looking for any sign of reaction, any indication that the treatment was working or failing catastrophically. 60 seconds passed. 90. 2 minutes. The pilot's breathing changed, became slightly less labored. His eyelids flickered. "Blood pressure's rising," Davies said, his fingers on the pilot's wrist. "I can feel it, sir. It's actually rising." Hartley allowed himself a breath. "Keep the drip going. We need to stabilize him enough for surgery." 3 hours later, after a field surgeon had removed the shrapnel and repaired the lung tissue, Hartley stood outside the medical tent drinking tea that tasted of diesel and sand. The Italian pilot was alive, unconscious, badly injured, facing weeks of recovery, but alive, against every statistical probability, against every piece of conventional medical wisdom. Alive. "You know they'll ask questions," Davies said quietly, appearing at his shoulder. "About why you use plasma on an enemy casualty when we've only got 47 bottles left, and 800 British lads who might need it." 46 bottles, Hartley corrected, "and they can ask all the questions they want." "And what will you tell them?" Hartley looked at the tea in his hands, watching steam rise into the cooling desert air. "That I'm tired of the mathematics. That I wanted to see if we could actually change the numbers for once." He paused. "That maybe the whole bloody point of being British is refusing to accept that death is inevitable, just because some equation says it should be." Davies was quiet for a moment. Then, "He'll probably have nightmares about us for the rest of his life, you know. British medics saving Italian pilots. It's not how war's supposed to work." "Good," Hartley said. "Maybe if enough of us have nightmares about keeping each other alive, we'll stop being quite so efficient at killing each other." Why, the plasma that saved the Italian pilot's life had begun its existence 9 months earlier, in a converted lecture hall at Cambridge University that smelled perpetually of antiseptic and damp wool. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton worked 16-hour days in a laboratory that had once hosted discussions of medieval poetry and now hosted discussions of protein degradation rates and freeze-drying temperatures. The laboratory was freezing. Coal rationing meant the heating ran only 4 hours daily between 14 Po and 18 So. Thornton wore 2 jumpers, a laboratory coat, and fingerless gloves that allowed her to manipulate pipettes and microscope slides without losing sensation completely. Her breath condensed in the air as she worked, creating small clouds of vapor that momentarily obscured her view of bacterial cultures and blood samples. Cambridge in January 1942 existed in a state of controlled deterioration. The university had given over most of its facilities to military research, training programs, and convalescent hospitals. Students who remained were predominantly women or men too young or unfit for military service. The town lived under blackout regulations. German bombers targeting London or Midlands industrial cities occasionally dropped their remaining ordnance on East Anglia, simply to lighten the load for the return flight. Thornton had been recruited from a civilian hospital in Manchester, where she'd specialized in hematology, blood disorders, clotting diseases, transfusion medicine. The Army Medical Services had approached her in November 1941, 3 weeks after her fiancé's destroyer had been torpedoed in the North Atlantic. They'd been apologetic but direct. "We need someone who understands blood, and we need them immediately." The problem they'd presented was brutal in its simplicity. British military casualties in North Africa and the Mediterranean were dying from blood loss at catastrophic rates. Field hospitals couldn't stockpile whole blood. It required refrigeration that didn't exist in desert conditions, and it degraded too quickly even when properly stored. Typing and matching blood took time that dying soldiers didn't have. The logistics of moving fresh blood from British donors to Egyptian field hospitals were impossible to solve. "What we need," the recruiting officer had said, "is blood that doesn't need refrigeration, blood that lasts indefinitely, blood that works for anyone." "You're describing something that doesn't exist," Thornton had replied. "Then we need someone to invent it." The theoretical basis had existed since the 1930s. American researchers had demonstrated that blood plasma, the liquid component remaining after red cells were removed, could be freeze-dried into powder, stored indefinitely, and reconstituted when needed. Plasma lacked the oxygen-carrying capacity of whole blood, but it contained the proteins and clotting factors necessary to prevent shock and death from trauma. The practical implementation was considerably more difficult. Thornton's laboratory received blood donations from volunteers across Cambridge, students, professors, civil servants, factory workers. The donation process was simple. Draw blood, allow it to settle in refrigerated containers, separate the clear yellowish plasma from the heavier red cells, process the plasma through a series of filtration and sterilization steps, freeze it rapidly using specialized equipment, then reduce the frozen plasma to powder using vacuum desiccation. Each step introduced potential contamination, protein degradation, or processing failure. The freeze-drying equipment was temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and calibration. The vacuum pumps failed regularly, necessitating repairs using cannibalized parts from other equipment, because proper replacements were unavailable due to metal rationing. The refrigeration units drew so much electricity that Thornton's laboratory shared a dedicated power line with a nearby RAF communications center, which meant plasma processing sometimes had to halt because fighter scrambles took priority. The laboratory staff consisted of Thornton, 2 research assistants who'd been medical students before conscription, eliminated most of the male undergraduate population, and a rotating group of volunteers who handled the initial blood collection and separation. They worked in overlapping 12-hour shifts, processing an average of 48 units of plasma weekly. Quality control was critical and terrifying. Every batch had to be tested for bacterial contamination, protein concentration, and reconstitution properties. Contaminated plasma would kill rather than save. Degraded plasma would fail to prevent shock. Plasma that wouldn't reconstitute properly was useless in field conditions. Thornton tested each batch personally, injecting reconstituted plasma into rabbits and monitoring their physiological response. She kept detailed logs of protein levels, clotting factors, and adverse reactions. She corresponded with American researchers conducting parallel experiments, though wartime mail delays meant letters took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic, making collaboration frustratingly asynchronous. The psychological toll was considerable. Thornton was acutely aware that every bottle of plasma she produced represented potential lives saved or potential deaths from her failures. She had nightmares about contaminated batches killing British soldiers, about protein degradation causing men to die despite receiving treatment, about her laboratory's limitations making her responsible for preventable deaths. In March 1942, the Military Medical Services requested field trials. They needed 48 bottles of plasma, properly packaged and stabilized for transport to North Africa. Thornton had 3 weeks to prepare the shipment. She worked through those 3 weeks with mechanical precision, sleeping 4 hours nightly on a cot in the laboratory's storage room. Her assistants matched her schedule without complaint. They'd all lost people, and they all understood that exhaustion was an acceptable price for potentially saving lives. The 48 bottles were packed in insulated containers with ice and shipped via military transport to Cairo, then forwarded to field hospitals across the Western Desert. Each bottle was accompanied by detailed reconstitution instructions, usage guidelines, and request forms for medical officers to document outcomes. Thornton had no way of knowing whether the plasma would work. She'd tested it extensively in laboratory conditions, but battlefield trauma was different. Wounded soldiers were dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted, and often suffering from multiple injuries simultaneously. Would plasma work for men in shock? Would it cause adverse reactions under extreme conditions? Would it save lives or merely delay death? 6 weeks after the shipment departed, Thornton received the first field report. Captain James Hartley, attached to a medical unit near El Alamein, reported successful use of plasma on an Italian pilot with massive chest trauma. Patient had survived surgery and was recovering. Hartley requested additional plasma supplies and suggested expanding field trials. Thornton read the report 3 times, standing in her freezing laboratory at 23 Dune, still wearing her outdoor coat because the heating had shut off 5 hours earlier. Then she sat down at her desk, put her head in her hands, and cried for the first time since her fiancé's death. The mathematics had changed. The equations that governed battlefield survival now included a new variable. Plasma worked. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel reviewed the casualty reports from his headquarters tent outside Tobruk with increasing bewilderment. The reports made no sense. German intelligence had been tracking British medical capabilities since the North African campaign began in 1940. The British suffered from chronic supply shortages, inadequate refrigeration for blood storage, and medical facilities stretched impossibly thin across 1,000-mile supply lines. Their field hospitals were undermanned and under-equipped. Their casualty evacuation procedures were slower than German standards. Their death rates from battlefield trauma should have been catastrophic. Instead, British survival rates were improving, significantly, inexplicably. They're losing less men to blood loss, his medical officer reported, laying out statistical analyses that showed the trend clearly. 3 months ago, their fatality rate for severe trauma was approximately 68%. Now it's 42%. That's not a marginal improvement, Herr General Feldmarschall. That's a fundamental change in battlefield medicine. Rommel studied the numbers. How? We don't know. We've interrogated captured British medical personnel. They mention new transfusion protocols, but they're either uninformed about the details or trained to withhold information. The few supplies we've captured from overrun field stations include standard medical equipment and some unusual bottles of yellow powder. Our chemists are analyzing the powder now. Yellow powder? Possibly a plasma preparation. The Americans have been experimenting with freeze-dried plasma, but intelligence suggested their trials were preliminary and unsuccessful. If the British have developed a functional plasma therapy, the medical officer paused, uncomfortable. It would explain the survival rate changes. Rommel felt the peculiar frustration that came from being outmaneuvered by an enemy who should have been at a disadvantage. German medical doctrine was superior in nearly every measurable way. German field hospitals had better equipment, more trained personnel, more efficient casualty evacuation procedures. The British were supposed to be losing the medical war by attrition alone. Plasma that doesn't require refrigeration, Rommel said slowly. Plasma that can be stored indefinitely and administered by field medics. If it works, yes, it would fundamentally alter battlefield medicine. The implications extended beyond individual survival rates. Medical evacuation represented a substantial logistics burden for any military. Wounded soldiers required transport, hospital space, convalescent facilities, and eventual replacement with fresh troops. If the British could save men who previously would have died, they were effectively increasing their available manpower without requiring additional recruitment or training. Moreover, plasma therapy represented a philosophical approach that contradicted German military doctrine. German medicine focused on efficiency and protocol, established procedures applied systematically to achieve predictable outcomes. The British approach appeared to be more experimental, more willing to implement unproven treatments, more comfortable with improvisation. Rommel had encountered this pattern repeatedly in North Africa. British forces excelled at improvisation, at making inadequate resources accomplish impossible tasks through sheer bloody-minded determination. They failed conventionally, but succeeded unconventionally. They lost battles, but refused to lose campaigns. The Italian pilot, Rommel said suddenly. The one captured after his fighter crashed near El Alamein. He was treated by British medical personnel before we negotiated his exchange. What was his condition? The medical officer consulted notes. Severe chest trauma, penetrating lung injury. He should have died within minutes, according to our medical assessment. The British apparently administered some form of transfusion therapy and performed emergency surgery. He survived. And we didn't question how that was possible. We assumed they'd had whole blood available. It seemed implausible, but not impossible. Rommel stood, pacing the confines of his headquarters tent. Outside, the desert night was cold and still, stars brilliant in the absence of light pollution. Somewhere across those empty miles, British medical units were saving soldiers who should have died, using technology that shouldn't exist yet, solving problems that German military doctrine said were unsolvable. I want a full intelligence assessment, Rommel ordered. Find out everything possible about British plasma capabilities, how it's produced, how it's transported, how widely it's distributed. If they've developed a functional battlefield plasma therapy, our entire casualty projection model is wrong. Elizabeth Thornton returned to Cambridge in August 1945, 3 months after victory in Europe, to a university attempting to remember what peacetime education looked like. The laboratory where she'd spent 4 years freeze-drying plasma had been reclaimed for biochemistry research. The equipment had been shipped to military hospitals or scrapped for metal. The records of her work were classified and stored in War Office archives. She was 41 years old. She'd never married. Her fiancé's death in 1941 had left her unable to imagine that particular future. She'd been appointed to a faculty position in the medical school, teaching hematology to students who'd spent their adolescence under bombardment and rationing and were now attempting to become doctors in a world that had forgotten how to value things that couldn't be weaponized. Occasionally, students asked about her war service. She deflected with humor. I made yellow powder in a freezing laboratory and hoped it wouldn't kill anyone. The students laughed, imagining some tedious administrative role, unaware that the yellow powder had saved approximately 14,300 lives, according to classified military estimates. Thornton herself didn't know that number. The War Office hadn't shared casualty statistics with civilian contractors. She knew only what appeared in the letters she occasionally received from medical officers who'd used her plasma. Thank you for the bottles you sent. They worked. Men lived who shouldn't have. James Hartley had written her once, in 1943, describing the Italian pilot who'd survived chest trauma that should have been fatal. "You changed the mathematics," Hartley had written. "You made death slightly less inevitable. That's not a small thing." The Italian pilot had recovered fully and been repatriated to Italy in a prisoner exchange. Hartley never learned his name. The pilot presumably returned to a country that had switched sides mid-war, bearing scars from British shrapnel and owing his life to British medicine. Thornton wondered sometimes if he thought about the irony. Plasma therapy became standard military practice by 1943. British, American, and Canadian blood services established industrial-scale collection and processing facilities. Plasma bottles became standard equipment in field hospitals, ambulances, and medical kits carried by combat units. The freeze-drying technology Thornton had helped develop was refined, scaled, and deployed globally. Post-war medical analysis estimated that plasma therapy reduced battlefield mortality from severe trauma by approximately 40%. 14,300 British lives saved, perhaps 50,000 Allied lives total when American and Canadian casualties were included. Numbers that would have been deaths became numbers that were recoveries. The German military never developed equivalent plasma capabilities during the war. Their medical doctrine, optimized for efficiency and protocol, struggled to implement experimental treatments at scale. By the time German researchers recognized the strategic value of plasma therapy, material shortages and collapsing infrastructure made industrial production impossible. Thornton occasionally lectured on wartime medical innovations, carefully avoiding classified details. She described the problem, battlefield trauma and blood loss, and the solution, plasma that could be stored and transported easily. She mentioned the cold laboratory, the temperamental equipment, the constant fear of contamination. She didn't mention the nightmares or the crying, or the fiancé who died before she could save anyone. In 1952, a researcher from the War Office visited Cambridge to interview Thornton for a historical record of British wartime medical innovations. He brought declassified reports, casualty statistics, and letters from soldiers who'd survived because of plasma therapy. "You should know," he said, "that your work is considered one of the most significant medical achievements of the war. Not just for the lives saved directly, but for establishing the principle that battlefield medicine could be genuinely innovative rather than merely reactive." Thornton read the letters he'd brought. They were from soldiers, mostly. Men who'd been wounded in North Africa, Italy, France, Burma. Men who'd received plasma transfusions in the field and survived long enough to reach surgical facilities. Some had written their letters in 1945, upon demobilization. Others had written recently, having learned their survival had been due to an experimental treatment. One letter was from an Italian man living in Rome. He explained that he'd been a fighter pilot shot down near El Alamein in 1942. He'd nearly died from chest wounds. British medics had saved him using some form of advanced transfusion therapy he didn't understand. He'd spent the remainder of the war in British custody, then returned to Italy to discover his country had changed sides, and his military service had become politically complicated. "I never learned the name of the British captain who saved me," the letter read. "I never learned where the medicine came from that kept me alive, but I married after the war. I have 3 children now. My daughter is studying medicine at university in Milan. She wants to be a doctor because I told her that British doctors saved my life when Italian doctors would have let me die. I don't know if you were involved in my treatment, but if you were, thank you. You gave me a life I didn't expect to have." Thornton read the letter twice, sitting in the War Office researcher's presence, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "May I keep a copy?" Of course. She never framed it, but she kept it in a drawer in her office where she could read it occasionally when teaching became frustrating or research seemed pointless. The letter reminded her that medicine at its best wasn't about protocols or efficiency or even survival rates. It was about the audacity of refusing to accept death as inevitable, even when all the mathematics insisted otherwise. The freeze-drying technology she'd helped develop eventually transformed civilian medicine. Blood banks adopted plasma collection and storage procedures derived directly from wartime research. Emergency medical services carried plasma for trauma cases. Disaster response teams stockpiled it for mass casualty situations. Thornton died in 1967, aged 63, from heart failure. Her obituary in the Cambridge papers mentioned her academic career and her wartime service in vague terms. It didn't mention the 14,300 lives, or the cold laboratory, or the Italian pilot who'd lived, because she'd refused to accept that the mathematics were fixed. But somewhere in Rome, a pilot who'd expected to die in the sand had grandchildren who might never know their existence, represented one small victory against the tyranny of inevitable death. And somewhere in the archives of British military medicine, her work remained classified proof that innovation born from desperation could rewrite the rules of war itself. If this story of British ingenuity and the determination to save lives moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the unsung heroes who changed history through quiet brilliance. What other wartime innovations do you think deserve recognition? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, every subscription helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light. Thank you for watching.